Hello and welcome to my YouTube channel. My name's Olivia and I am a freshman at Temple University. This video is going to be all about the stigma surrounding drug addiction and drug addicts in society. We will discuss what the stigma is surrounding addiction, how that stigma is harmful for addicts, and how that stigma can be misleading. Okay, so first to discuss, what is stigma on addiction? There's a lot of stigma surrounding addiction, but one of the most popular stigmas surrounding it is that the individuals who are addicted made that choice for themselves, and it's their fault they're addicted, believing that addicts have failed ethically and morally by choosing to do the wrong thing. And an article from 2014, I included a quote that says, quote, 43% of physicians consider addiction involving alcohol to be at least in part a personal or moral weakness, end quote. But that is not the only stigmatization made around addiction. Some other common stigmatizations made are that people often perceive drug addicts to be dangerous, scary, dirty, and or crazy. Just like how you'll hear people, if you live near a city, to say if you see someone who seems like they're under the influence to just stay away or don't look at them or something like that. And I included a quote from the same article from the last slide that just kind of shows some of the words that people associate with addiction. And it says, quote, 2009 National Survey of Adults underscores the considerable stigma still associated with addiction. Words commonly used to describe those with the disease include sinner, irresponsible, selfish, stupid, loser, undisciplined, pathetic, and weak, end quote. But how does this stigma affect the addicts themselves? Well, for one, there are many drawbacks that addicts have to face in society. In an article from the American Addiction Center, they provided a list of some of the results from a Johns Hopkins survey that was about the stigmatization around addiction. And I picked out my top 3 to include in this video, but I will be leaving a link to this article in the description if anybody wants to check out the full list for themselves. But the ones I included are, quote, 90% are unwilling to have a person with drug addiction marry into their family, compared to 59% for a person with mental illness, end quote. The second one I included was, quote, 62% will work with someone who has mental illness, whereas only 22% will work with someone who has drug addiction, end quote. And the last one I included is that, quote, 3 in 10 people believe that recovery from drug addiction is impossible, end quote. And those are only 3 that I chose from the article, and I could probably name more, but it is pretty clear that people with drug addiction do face drawbacks in society because of the stigma surrounding addiction. However, drawbacks in society is not the only harmful effect that addicts face from stigma on addiction. Degrading language is another harmful effect that they face. And from the same article mentioned in the prior slide, I included a quote that says, quote, junkie, stoner, drunkard, crackhead, tweaker. These are just some of the many dismissive terms commonly used to describe individuals with substance use disorders, end quote. And this basically just highlights how this type of language dismisses them. It dismisses people who are addicted to drugs, and it lowers their value to lower than the average non-addictive person, as if they're like worth less. And this is harmful because it leads the addicted individuals to internalize negative societal views about them, and then they will feel things like shame, guilt, and hopelessness. And this can even cause them to hide their addiction and not seek treatment because they're scared of being judged in a negative light. And those same consequences that I just spoke of, like feeling loneliness, hopelessness, no self-worth, hiding their addiction, fearing judgment, etc., they all also stem from the first mentioned stigma that addicts are at fault for their addiction because they made that choice themselves, and they're wrong for going against better moral judgment. And there are tons of other harmful effects that addicts have to face themselves because of the stigmatization on addiction. I only picked out a few, but it is clear that the stigma surrounding addiction is actively harming those who suffer with addiction in terms of their self-worth, and it's preventing them from getting the help that they need because of fear and judgment. Alright, so moving on, how is the stigmatization on addiction misleading? And I just included this, just random quote of, just expressing the ideology that, oh, it's their fault. They chose to try it and they kept doing it until they were addicted. They chose to sin, they gave in to sin, and all that. Just that statement, that ideology that all addicts are at fault for their own addiction because they are, quote unquote, choosing it, is just extremely ignorant and just flat out false. Alright, so how is this ignorant? For one, I think it's ignorant to make an assumption about a broad group in any situation. I don't think it's fair to make one assumption about a group of hundreds of thousands, even millions of people. But in the case of stigmatization on addiction, I think it's ignorant to say that it's their fault because they chose it and things like that, because it does not take into account the situation in which the addicted individual first started using. Doesn't take into account whether it came from a medical standpoint and it was administered to them, the environment they were raised in, their atmosphere. All of those are big factors in a person's first use of a drug. And I could give out a ton of hypotheticals and examples of this, but the one that I chose to use, because it's just so easily researched, there's a ton of data on it, is the opioid epidemic in America, which was the way Purdue Pharma used corruption, and they pushed past the FDA, and they used aggressive marketing, stuff like that, to push Oxycontin out into medical practices. And they didn't talk about the addictive features initially, and it basically just created, from the late 90s to the early 2010s, it created this atmosphere where literally so many citizens were getting addicted to Oxy from a medical standpoint because it was being administered to them, and this pharmaceutical company was able to get through the government to not discuss how highly addictive Oxycontin is. And that in turn triggered the American opioid epidemic, where so many people especially from the late 90s to the early 2010s, became addicted from a medical standpoint because they were being administered. It was administered to them from a doctor. And I think this is just a prime example, a main example that shows how ignorant it is to say that all addicts they choose to do this, because a lot of people, because of Purdue Pharma and the way it was worked around the government and things like that, so many innocent people sadly got addicted to opioids and Oxycontin because they were administered it medically without their doctors knowing the addictive side effects. Alright, and to continue, now I'm going to do how this stigma is false. I just did how it was ignorant. Sorry if that was a little kind of hectic getting into all the Purdue Pharma stuff. I am going to provide 2 links to that to just get a little more information, but it is simply if you Google anything on that, there's a lot of information on it. It's probably better explaining it than I am. But how's the stigma that addiction is a bad moral judgment and a choice false? Well, it's false because addiction is not just engaging in a bad moral judgment. It is a physiological disease. From that same article that I used earlier in the video, and I will be leaving a site at the very end of the video with all of my sources, but from that same article I included a quote that says, quote, "The evidence demonstrates that it is," talking about addiction, "the evidence demonstrates that it is a complex disease of the brain, often chronic in nature rather than a sign of moral weakness," end quote. And medical evidence, there's tons of evidence that shows that addiction, it alters and changes the brain chemistry, causing physical drug cravings, rather than the idea that addiction is simply choosing to, quote unquote, get high for fun. And just that stigmatized idea that addicts are just, they're just simply making a bad moral choice over and over again. They just don't care about it anymore. They just want to keep getting high because they like it. When in reality that is not the case. There's medical and scientific evidence that backs up and shows that it is a physical disease. And just to conclude, stigma surrounding addiction it's very harmful and degrading for addicts. So that's why I chose this topic. I feel like it's not talked about enough, and I just wanted to spread some awareness on it. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. thank you for bearing through it with me. This is my first time doing a voiceover, so I do appreciate it. And if you or anyone you know is suffering from addiction, help is available. The National Substance Abuse Hotline is 866-210-1303. Again, that number is 866-210-1303. Thanks for watching.